Kelsey Mitchell's not going to say a word about Caitlin Clark. She's going to credit everybody else on this team.
I think the good thing about our team is that, we got so many great pieces. I think so. And I think you just got to gut check a lot. And I think that once we discipline ourselves to not let teams back in it, I think we...
Okay, so you brought up Sophie. I don't know where nobody asked. Okay, you brought up Sophie.
Please, any of them. And so I think this is about me just staying mindful of my runs and staying mindful of my angles.
She got some easier looks. Yeah. Maybe Trista was right on Connecticut's defense. And that they
On June 9, 2026, with the Indiana Fever trailing the Washington Mystics by 1 point and 4.3 seconds remaining on the clock, Sophie Cunningham threw a long cross-court inbound pass to Caitlin Clark. Clark's defender gambled for the steal and came up empty. Clark caught, planted, and buried a 31-foot three-pointer to give Indiana a 78-76 victory. By any objective standard, it was a significant moment. A clutch shot under extreme pressure from a distance few players in the league attempt in practice, let alone with a game on the line. The Fever improved to 6-5. Clark finished with a game-high 19 points. In the NBC broadcast booth, the reaction was not uniform. A clip captured Sue Bird, Cheryl Miller, and LaChina Robinson watching the final sequence unfold. When the ball cleared the net, Miller nearly rose from her chair. Robinson broke into open laughter. Bird smiled, then held still. In the seconds after one of the more dramatic plays of the early 2026 WNBA season, the studio's most prominent legend registered, by visible measure, the least enthusiasm. That image circulated through social media before the post-game press conference had even begun. The response from Clark's fanbase was immediate, pointed, and depending on where you stood, either a proportionate reaction to a clear pattern or an overreach directed at a broadcaster who had, in many documented instances, spoken positively about Clark. The debate that followed was not really about 6 seconds of broadcast footage. It was the product of nearly 2 years of accumulated grievance. Attention rooted in the specific way Sue Bird, one of the most decorated players in the history of women's basketball, has chosen to discuss, frame, and periodically redirect conversations about the most commercially significant player in the WNBA today. To understand why a muted smile in a broadcast booth triggered this level of reaction, it is necessary to work backward through the record. Sue Bird played professional basketball for 2 decades. She won 4 WNBA championships with the Seattle Storm and 5 Olympic gold medals with the United States national team. She is, by nearly every formal measure, among the 3 or 4 most accomplished players in the history of the league. Since retiring, she moved into media work, co-hosting a podcast alongside Megan Rapinoe and serving as an on-air analyst for NBC's WNBA coverage. She also holds a formal administrative role with USA Basketball, where she is responsible for identifying players for major international competition, including the 2026 FIBA Women's World Cup and the 2028 Summer Olympics. These roles give Bird unusual reach across the sport. She covers Clark as a broadcaster, evaluates her as a national team administrator, and shapes conversations about her on a platform she controls. Few figures in women's basketball operate across that many lanes simultaneously. Caitlin Clark arrived in the WNBA as the first overall draft pick, coming off back-to-back national championship game appearances at Iowa and one of the most watched NCAA tournament runs in the sport's history. In her rookie season, she averaged 19.2 points, 8.4 assists, and 5.7 rebounds per game, won Rookie of the Year, and drove viewership and attendance to levels the league had not previously recorded. Her second season was cut short by groin and ankle injuries that limited her to just 13 games. She returned for the 2026 campaign and entered early June leading the league in assists while averaging just over 20 points per game. Her commercial footprint extended well beyond those numbers. Before playing a single professional minute, Clark had secured endorsement arrangements described by industry observers as historically large for a player in the women's game. The gap between her individual media coverage and that of any other WNBA player was substantial, a fact acknowledged by multiple parties, including Bird herself. It was that gap and who gets to talk about it and how that became the fault line. The first broadly noted friction between Bird's commentary and Clark's fanbase emerged in December 2025 during an episode of Bird's podcast featuring a guest who described the league's tensions from the prior season without naming specific players. For most listeners, the context made the identity of the player being discussed obvious. Bird's audible reaction in that moment, a knowing laugh, an air of shared understanding, was interpreted by a significant portion of Clark's audience as an implicit endorsement of a narrative they considered reductive and unfair. The response was not measured. Comment sections across platforms filled with accusations that Bird was a Clark antagonist, that jealousy was motivating her conduct, that the credibility of any broadcaster aligned with her perspective was forfeit. Critics were not operating in the language of media analysis. They were registering something more visceral. a sense that a player who had done everything asked of her was being systematically denied the acknowledgement she had earned, and that Bird was an instrument of that denial. Bird did not escalate the dispute. Neither did Clark. The moment passed, but the perception it created did not. In the months that followed, a pattern in Bird's public commentary became the basis for a more organized critique. Bird argued on her podcast that Paige Bueckers, the Dallas Wings' first overall pick in the 2025 draft, deserved comparable media coverage to what Clark was receiving. She framed the argument as additive rather than comparative, stating explicitly that Clark deserved everything she received and that Bueckers simply deserved more. She noted that Bueckers' fan base and cultural pull had been underrated by the industry, and that the media had a responsibility to course correct. Taken in isolation, the argument was defensible. Broader coverage of women's basketball as a whole was a reasonable goal. But for an audience already attuned to the frequency with which Bird raised Bueckers in the vicinity of conversations about Clark, the framing carried weight beyond its stated intention. In a media ecosystem with finite attention, any sustained effort to redirect coverage toward another player, regardless of how it was justified, functioned as a practical dilution of that coverage. Bird also characterized Bueckers as constitutionally different from Clark as a player. Someone who would take time to read her environment and establish herself gradually rather than asserting dominance from the opening weeks of her career. This was framed as a neutral distinction. It did not land neutrally. The 2026 season opened with the Fever operating under compounding pressures. Clark was healthy for the first time in over a year, but the team's results were inconsistent and the atmosphere around the franchise was unsettled. By late May, Clark's on-court behavior, her visible arguments with officials, her intensity during losses, had drawn formal consequences. In her first WNBA season, she received 6 technical fouls across the full year. In the 2026 season, she had already accumulated 2 technical fouls in just 7 appearances. During NBC's broadcast coverage in early June, Bird addressed this directly and on the record. "It comes to a point where I think an area of growth for Caitlin is these moments of frustration," Bird said. "When she's frustrated on the court, when she's not getting the calls, when she's getting calls against her. These are areas all players need to handle." She added that championship-caliber players and championship teams find ways to perform when the officiating is not going in their favor. The statement was accurate in its substance. The technical foul numbers were real, and the question of whether Clark's on-court conduct was creating problems for Indiana was legitimate. Bird had also, in a separate context around the same period, spoken in detailed and flattering terms about Clark's physical recovery, describing her speed, her ability to stop and shoot the 3 off the dribble, and her precision in finding teammates in transition. But for fans watching Bird consistently identify areas for Clark's improvement during a period when Clark was leading the league in assists and completing her return from serious injury, the tone of the critical commentary registered differently than its content. The issue was not whether Bird's observations were grounded in fact. The issue was what it meant that those observations, rather than the performance metrics, consistently anchored Bird's public framing of Clark. The sideline confrontation between Clark and head coach Stephanie White during Indiana's blowout loss to the Portland Fire intensified the conversation further. Clark, limited to 21 minutes by foul trouble, was visibly heated during a timeout exchange with White. The footage circulated widely. Bird, appearing on NBC's broadcast, characterized the moment as ordinary friction between 2 competitive people navigating a difficult game. "I've had moments like that with coaches," Bird said. "It doesn't have some deeper meaning to it." She drew on her own career to contextualize the exchange as a normal feature of high-stakes basketball relationships. Cheryl Miller, appearing alongside her, offered a sharper read. Miller suggested the emotions had crossed a line, that it was one thing for frustration to exist behind closed doors and another for it to become disruptive in a public huddle to the point where a head coach had to intervene in front of the team. "When it becomes that disruptive for the entire team, somebody has to step in," Miller said. Lexi Hull, speaking separately from inside the locker room, described the incident as an unremarkable product of in-game frustration that had not carried into the team's internal life. Bird's interpretation on this occasion aligned more closely with the player's own account than Miller's did. That did not reduce the scrutiny. For Bird's most vocal critics, individual instances of fair or favorable commentary were not sufficient to counteract what they perceived as the directional trend of her coverage as a whole. The night of June 8 did not unfold easily for Clark. She had entered the game against Washington, having connected on 14 of 50 field goal attempts in recent outings, and just 6 of 22 from 3-point range. The prior Saturday, against New York, she had scored 10 points on under 29% shooting, committed 3 turnovers, and fouled out early. Monday offered a partial corrective. Clark scored 10 in the first quarter, finished with 19 for the game, and added 5 assists. but the night nearly went the wrong way at the free throw line. Clark missed critical attempts in the final minutes, allowing Washington to retake the lead. With 4.3 seconds remaining and Indiana down by 1, the Fever called timeout and drew up the final play. Cunningham's inbound pass found Clark wide open on the wing after the Mystics' defender gambled for the steal. Clark caught the ball 31 feet from the basket with time expiring and put it through the net cleanly. In the broadcast booth, the divergence in reactions was again visible. Miller nearly rose from her seat. Robinson laughed. Bird smiled and stayed still. When Bird spoke with Clark in the immediate postgame segment, she opened by referencing the missed free throws. "We were just talking about the missed free throws. We're gonna skip over that," Bird said to Clark, who pushed back without hesitation. "No, that was terrible." "That's not okay, Sue," Clark replied. She described the mental reset that allowed her to stay present through the miscues and execute when it mattered. Clark had also addressed the missed free throws voluntarily in her separate postgame press conference. She did not need to be reminded. That was not, for her supporters, the point. The point was the choice Bird made in the immediate aftermath of a 31-foot game winner, to anchor the postgame exchange in what had gone wrong rather than what had gone right. Clark herself agreed the free throws were unacceptable. That agreement was not the source of the criticism. The framing was social media's response to the broadcast footage of Bird's reaction to the game winner was extensive and in places extreme. One widely circulated comment speculated, with no restraint, about Bird's emotional state and her anticipated conduct in the hours following the shot. The language in the comment sections was not uniformly careful. It was, however, consistent in its underlying argument that Bird's conduct toward Clark across 2 seasons reflected something more than neutral professional analysis. That argument had been developing since December 2025. When the podcast controversy first generated significant backlash, Clark supporters accused a generation of former players and league figures of systematically downplaying Clark's impact on the WNBA. The accusation was directed at a broader institutional posture, not only at Bird. But Bird, given her formal platform and her administrative authority, received a disproportionate share of the focus. The economic dimension of that posture is not incidental. Clark arrived in the professional league and rapidly secured commercial relationships of a scale that women's basketball had not previously generated for a single player. The league's television arrangements expanded. Attendance records fell regularly. Cities that had shown limited prior interest in the professional women's game began filling arenas. The financial benefits, while broadly distributed across the league, were not equitably distributed in proportion to the histories of the players who had built the institution. Clark was now the face of players who had competed under collective bargaining terms they publicly criticized as inadequate, who had spent careers advocating for resources that comparable professional athletes in men's sports took for granted, watched as one player's arrival reorganized the league's financial and cultural significance at a pace that outpaced any structural adjustment to how that value was shared. The resentment that produced where it existed was not irrational. It was the product of specific historical conditions. Bird had been one of the most prominent voices in the fight to improve those conditions. Her perspective on the league's development was shaped by that history in ways that were substantive and earned. But that history also created, for a portion of Clark's fan base, a working hypothesis that Bird's commentary about Clark could not be fully separated from an older set of stakes, and that what looked like neutral analysis was being inflected, consciously or not, by an institutional investment in a particular version of how the league's success was supposed to be understood. Whether Bird holds personal resentment toward Clark is a question the available record cannot answer. What the record does show is a consistent pattern of commentary that her critics have found more attentive to Clark's limitations than to her achievements. Delivered from a platform with significant reach by a figure whose formal roles give her ongoing authority over how Clark is publicly framed, Bird defended Clark when the WNBA issued the Fever a warning over the missed injury report filing. She characterized the Clark-White sideline confrontation as routine competitive friction. She offered specific, detailed praise for Clark's physical recovery in the 2026 season, describing the speed, precision, and playmaking ability Clark had recaptured after her injury. These were not the comments of someone engaged in a sustained effort to undermine a player. They were, in aggregate, the comments of someone covering a player with genuine complexity, acknowledging strengths while maintaining a focus on areas requiring growth, maintaining an editorial position that Clark supporters found consistently uncharitable, even when it was factually accurate. The gap between those two characterizations, Bird as a fair if demanding analyst versus Bird as a figure with a structural disposition against fully crediting Clark, is where the argument has lived for 2 seasons. It is not a gap that additional data points will easily close because the disagreement is not primarily about facts. It is about interpretation, and about what kinds of frameworks are being applied to which players and whether those frameworks are consistent. For the Fever, the external noise was secondary to more operational concerns. The franchise had moved through several weeks of visible turbulence: the coaching confrontation, the injury report violation, the shooting slump, results that left them hovering around the .500 line. Clark was performing at an elite statistical level, but the team around her had not yet produced the kind of sustained consistency a championship contender requires. The win over Washington on June 9 was one point of stabilization in an ongoing process. The shot that sealed it was not a product of designed execution. Clark's defender's gamble created the opening, and Clark's ability to bury a contested three-pointer from 31 feet with 4 seconds remaining was the determining factor. It happened. The footage exists. It is the kind of play that resists easy dismissal, regardless of the narrative surrounding it. What Bird said about it in the postgame moment, what her face showed when it happened, and what those observations did or did not reveal about her orientation toward Clark. Those questions will continue generating commentary as long as both women occupy the same professional space. That space, with Bird in the booth and Clark on the floor, is the central stage of the WNBA's most watched weekly broadcast. It is not a comfortable arrangement for everyone within it, and the discomfort has become part of the story the league is telling about itself in 2026. The audience that formed around Caitlin Clark is not passive. It watched the free throw comment. It cataloged the muted reaction to the game winner. It connected individual moments to the broader pattern and reached conclusions that were not charitable to Bird. It has made clear, in the volume and consistency of its response, that it is evaluating more than the play on the floor. Whether that scrutiny produces any structural accountability, or whether it remains a feature of the ambient noise surrounding the league's most visible player, depends in part on how the people with authority over broadcast relationships and public narratives choose to respond to it. For now, the dynamic holds. Clark plays, Bird analyzes, and the distance between what Clark's supporters believe they are watching and what they feel they are being given continues to define the terms of the conversation.